What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. This is your host, Brandon DeCruz, and today I have the honor of welcoming back someone I consider both a friend and a mentor, Dr. Scott Stevenson, back on the show to expand upon the topic of thyroid hormone, which is something that we touched a little bit on in our previous podcast. But just last month, Scott and I did a deep dive into the science of fat burners, which was released as episode 117 of the show. So if you guys haven't listened to that one, I would definitely suggest going back. We've gotten a lot of good feedback on that. But in that episode itself, we touched briefly on thyroid hormone. However, this is an area I wanted to expand upon further with Scott, as thyroid is an important hormone when it comes to the goal of physique optimization and physique improvement, as well as health optimization. And it's one of the most common hormonal issues that clients come to me with, especially considering the fact that at this point in my career, a lot of the women and others that I work with and that come to me for coaching, they often have a long history of dieting and have micronutrient deficiencies from being in a state of low energy availability for an extended period of time due to following the latest fad diet. And this is something that's pretty prevalent in today's society. So, before we get into today's topic, I'm going to do a primer into thyroid physiology. But first and foremost, Scott, I just want to thank you for coming on, and I want to hear how things are going on your end, my man.
Absolutely, man. Things are going good. You have a trip. We just talked about it. You're heading off for Masters Nationals. Those will be
Yes, sir.
probably over by the time this podcast makes it out.
Yes, it will
Um,
be.
I'm taking the dogs. We're driving back to Tampa. I'm going to buy a trailer.
Oh, yeah.
Like my sort of survival get off grid trailer with full roof, full of solar. I can put my electric motorcycle in there, so I can drag that behind my RV. So I'm kind of looking. I'm ready for the Armageddon, baby. So I got to
Let's
get
get
up
it.
early tomorrow too and get that sucker. It's always fun to take a road trip with dogs.
Absolutely.
And
I'm going to have an 8 hour road trip, so I'll be by myself, but I will be in
yeah,
spirit with you guys.
yeah, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, we'll be driving at the same time, I think, roughly. You'll
Yeah.
get there, probably arrive at the same time if I get going early enough. So
Hell yeah. All
yeah,
right. So in respect to that, because I do want to respect your time, and I also know that we're a little bit on a constrained time budget today in
yeah.
comparison to our last podcast that went 2 hours and 20 minutes, which
Oh,
luckily we had no
really?
complaints. It was 2 hours and 20 minutes. But
Oh,
you know
wow.
what? The audience loved it. A lot of individuals that are common or frequent listeners of the show, they told me that they just divided up across like their weekly cardio sessions. So it was kind of like a drip fed that they got,
Yeah,
like they would go through like ephedrine and clenbuterol. It would be a 40-minute block, and then they would
sure.
do their next 40-minute block. So it gave a lot of at least entertainment and educational value for an extended period of time. But today we're going to do a little bit more of a compressed episode. We have a lot of topics to cover, but first, to start this podcast out, I wanted to provide some background info on thyroid hormone and take you all through a primer on how thyroid hormone is endogenously produced. So how it is naturally produced, so that you guys have essentially a baseline understanding of thyroid hormone physiology before we get into more of the nitty-gritty details and answer some of the questions that I received regarding thyroid, not only over the years, but also in respect to the last podcast that Scott and I did together. So essentially, your thyroid is the powerhouse of your metabolism, which regulates your metabolic rate and your energy expenditure levels, and it influences energy levels and body weight regulation, as well as many other components of your body composition, your biofeedback, and your lifestyle. And now, thyroid is so important, because if we actually think about it on a physiological level, thyroid hormone affects virtually every single organ system in the body. So this is going to include your heart, your central nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, your bone, your GI tract, and your metabolism. So every
Mhm.
single cell in the body has a receptor for thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormones are involved in the development and maintenance of almost all our tissues. So seeing as thyroid impacts every cell and tissue in the body, this is an important hormone to pay attention to. And it's one of the hormones that I have dug deep into as a coach, as I believe it's important to understand its function and to monitor it with the clients that I work with, especially as I work with very body composition focused clients. And a downregulated thyroidal axis can make the body composition and health improvement and optimization processes much more challenging. So if we look at just the roles that thyroid plays in the body, it has a role in controlling and impacting our metabolic rate, our body weight regulation, body temperature regulation, cardiovascular system, our heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, carb and fat metabolism, appetite. It impacts blood lipid levels and also cholesterol metabolism, and it plays roles in growth and repair and also in skeletal muscle. And so thyroid is involved in almost every single function in the body, and it works somewhat like a thermostat. This is kind of the analogy that I give a lot of clients. It works like a thermostat, which will tell your body to either upregulate or to downregulate different processes based on the inputs it receives. So that could be your environment, that could be your nutritional status, that could be your micronutrient status. stress in your life. There's so many different factors that come into the equation on how thyroid is being produced and also how it's influenced in your internal physiology. So, for example, the health and function of your thyroid can upregulate or it can downregulate your metabolic rate, your energy production, your cholesterol metabolism, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and also your body temperature regulation. And so, if you don't have adequate thyroid hormone production and function, it can impact every cell and tissue in the body. So, in order to optimize your metabolism and your body composition, we must make sure your thyroid is in a good place. Now that you understand essentially what the thyroid does from a broad-based perspective, I'm going to go through a brief primer on how thyroid hormone, production is regulated. So, if we look at it from a physiological perspective, thyroid hormone production is regulated by the HPT axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. And in a normal healthy person, now keep in mind someone that has good internal physiology, good nutritional status, this is the ideal person or the normal healthy individual. Um, the thyroid is controlled through a negative feedback loop where levels of T4 and T3 stimulate TRH, which stimulates TSH, which signals to the thyroid gland how much thyroid to produce. So, what I really want you guys to consider, and if you guys go back to the podcast I've done, at least on this podcast channel, I've done at least 5+ podcasts over the years on metabolic adaptation. I always talk about, let's think about the brain first. Let's start at the hypothalamus. And so, when we look at thyroid physiology, everything starts at the level of the brain and specifically in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus produces TRH, which is thyrotropin releasing hormone. Then TRH then signals to the pituitary gland to produce TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which many of you will probably be familiar with, as that is one of the most commonly checked markers on blood work. So then from there, TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones, which are predominantly released to the target tissues in the form of T4, which is our inactive thyroid hormone, but there's also a small amount of T3 that's secreted as well. Now, when we look at the endogenous, aka the natural production of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland, the average person will produce approximately 100 micrograms of T4 and 6 micrograms of T3. So the majority of thyroid hormone produced by the thyroid gland is inactive. It's in that form of T4. However, T4 will travel to other peripheral tissues, such as the liver, even the gut, and it can be converted into metabolically active T3. So when we look at this in totality, the conversion of inactive T4 to metabolically active T3 generally produces an additional 23 micrograms of T3 per day. So in a healthy individual with proper thyroid function, they produce about 100 micrograms of T4 and a total of 29 micrograms of T3 per day. And this is important for you guys to realize and take note of because we're going to discuss thyroid replacement therapy later. And many times coaches are prescribing thyroid doses that are far in excess of this natural production, which can cause issues as thyroid hormone is essentially a hormone that works like many others. So what I mean by that is it essentially has a Goldilocks zone, essentially, where we don't want it too low, but we also don't want it too high, as both extremes or both sides of the spectrum can have, extreme side effects. And so when it comes down to it, I have given you guys a primer just on how endogenous thyroid is produced. But Scott, I'm going to have you take over at this point. And if you could you go over some of the thyroid hormones we need to know? So that could include TRH, TSH, T4, T3, and then also reverse T3.
Right. So just so folks know, thyrotropin is the same thing as TSH. So that thyrotropin releasing hormone is basically thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. TSH releasing hormone. So when you see TRH or thyrotropin releasing hormone, it's one of the same things. So we have a phenomenal, we have numerous axes that are involving the hypothalamus pituitary. Hypothalamus is sort of our survival center in the brain. So you've got appetite regulation going on there. You've got control of all the pituitary hormones. So we're controlling testosterone production, growth hormone production, thyroid hormone production, cortisol's involved here, ACTH, the whole kit and caboodle. We've got all the primary hormones that are being controlled by the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So thyroid being one of those. And as you said, the main form of thyroid is T4. So what that means is when we look at thyroid hormone, the hormone itself, it's made out of a couple tyrosine amino acids. And then we have 4 iodine molecules on it. So T4 is the one that has 4 on it. What happens then is the extent to which thyroid can bind to its receptor, and it's got a nuclear receptor, and we're not going to go into those details, but when thyroid thyroid is doing its duty. It's also got a membrane receptor too, but its main function depends, of course, on how well it binds to its receptor. So T4 is really kind of a prohormone. People know what that means. And we have enzymes. In fact, there's 3 different kinds of them that are called deiodinases. So they deiodinize, they remove an iodine from T4. And when you remove 1 from 4, you get 3. So you get T3. And that's what T3 is, right? But we have four areas on that thyroid hormone backbone where you can remove those iodines. So 4 is fully loaded with iodines. If you take the right iodine off, then you get an active T3 molecule. What can also happen, because we got the body's very intricate, it's very tricky. It wants to be able to control things at multiple levels. So we have redundancies all across the body in terms of the endocrine system, the nervous system. It's really quite fascinating. The more you dig into physiology and biology, you realize, wow, the body's got a backup for the backup for the backup. So one of the things that can also happen is you can create a T3 molecule that isn't an active one. If you remove a different iodine, that's called reverse T3. So that can actually be measured on blood work. And if you go down to deiodinize one more time with a couple of the deiodinase enzymes can do this, you can actually get to T2, which has typically been thought of as being like an inactive thyroid hormone, but it actually does have actions like lipolytic actions, for instance. And that
It
one's
was a
almost,
common supplement, my friend.
yeah, it was. Yeah, but back in the day. Yeah. And shuts you down really bad from what I understand. Yeah. Was that in what was the name? Uh Kinetics, lipokinetics? Was that the name of the supplement?
I don't remember that
I don't,
exact product, but there was a product by Giant Sports, which was released in the early 2000s and into the 2010s that was marketed as a non-stimulant fat burner. But there were people that had a almost stimulant-like effect like you would get with a T3 or a T4. And it was very
oh,
interesting because it's the chemical nomenclature, if you look at it, it's like 3,5 and then triiodidine, like essentially like the same thing
yeah.
as T3 would be, but it just had a
Uh-huh.
different chemical nomenclature. So essentially what it was a
Iodine.
pro-hormone 2 thyroid. Just like
Mm-hmm.
at that era, think about the early 2000s. This is before the 2014 Banned Substance Control Act of pro hormones. So at that
Mm-hmm.
point, they had all of these isomers and all these. We know that they essentially went to Russian textbooks, took steroids that had been defunct, essentially, or debunked,
Right.
and then they took, and Patrick Arnold, especially because I'm from Jersey, and that's where
Yeah.
Patrick was based out of.
Right.
He was like really the person that was prominent in
Man,
terms of Balco investigations and things of that sort.
he
And they were
was.
just essentially taking the isomers off and just kind of taking different chemical derivatives. So it was not to go down that
Mhm.
rabbit hole, but it just reminds me of my early days in the supplement industry where there was a lot more hormones on the market than a lot of people realize, to say the least.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, Patrick was the man. He's so underrecognized, I think, for what he did back in that time. But um, anyway, so we've got T4, T3, and T2. Those are kind of easy. I've got to actually, for those who are more interested in some other details that we might cover, I've got actually a talk I gave on John Meadows' site on thyroid hormone maybe 6 months ago or so. And T3 is also called that's the technical term, the easiest term to understand is triiodothyronine. So tri meaning 3. T4 is tetraiodothyronine. If you're talking about T2, it'd be diiodothyronine. But T3 is also called leothyronine, and T4 is thyroxine or levothyroxine. So those can get kind of confusing. I have to look them up every once in a while too if you read too much of this stuff. And I have a list, actually, I'm not going to read through it here, but I have a list of all the different names, of the brand names of the different T3 and T4 T4 products that are available out there. So we have this system of controlling the ionization state of an individual thyroid molecule. And what that allows us to do, the short and sweet of this, is these 3 different deiodinase enzymes are located in different parts of the body. So we've got a deep one, and luckily they're named simply as well: D1,
D1,
D2,
D2, yeah.
D3. Yeah, the 3 different types. So type 1, type 2, type 3 deiodinase. And type 2, so what happens with that T4, kind of the standard way it's explained is the T4 will make its way to the tissue, and then the tissue, based on its energy status, will make a decision to what extent it wants to experience the metabolic revving effect, so to speak, of T3, which are all sorts of things. We covered that already to some degree. So that D2 enzyme in the tissues will be regulated by energy status and will determine to what degree T4 gets converted to T3. The D2, ironically, can also take reverse T3, which isn't typically active, and convert that to T2. So we have that there. In the liver and the kidney, actually the thyroid itself, we have D1, and the regulation or the activity there will reflect how much T3 we have in the plasma, in the blood floating around. So we've got T3 that's floating around, that's converted, for instance, in the liver, that will have an effect then by making its way to the tissues, turning on your metabolic rate, increasing energy expenditure, having the effects on the heart. You'll notice it. Maybe have one of the hallmarks of hyperthyroidism is not being able to sleep. Not a pleasant thing. So that is controlled to some degree by the D1, and also the D3 is what we'll see in the brain, and that's involved with degrading both T4 and D3, T4 and T3, and you may actually get some T2 though. So that's part of the regulatory process where the brain's trying to figure out how to control the system overall. So when, for instance, you take in T3 by itself, it's basically bypassing a lot of this because you don't see a reversal unless you're talking about thyroid production in the thyroid gland, where it's assembling T4 from iodine and precursors. You're not going to see T3 going back to T4. So you take in T3 as a supplement, it's going to have a direct effect. You take in T4, and we mentioned this in the last podcast. Now you've got something where you're feeding the body with the main form of the hormone that it makes use of, and then allowing it to make use of its own regulatory system to determine what kind of a metabolic effect you're going to have there.
So just to explain, Scott,
Sure.
just real briefly to the audience so they can
Yeah.
understand from an endogenous perspective, we see about 90% of the thyroid hormone that's secreted naturally is going to be in the form of the inactive form, which is T4, and then about 10% is
Exactly.
T3. However, when we actually look at the free, the actual thyroid hormone molecules that bind with receptors, it's actually T3 accounts for about 90%, and then T4 only accounts for 10%. So it's almost like a reversal of that. So really, when
Yeah.
it comes down to it, T3 is that active hormone, especially free T3, is the active hormone that's not bound to the protein carriers, which essentially are exerting its metabolically active functions. That is what is exhibiting its effects on metabolic rate, even GI motility, all these different downstream effects that we really thought about or that we really spoke about in the beginning of the podcast. So really what we're looking towards is T4 being a substrate for converting into T3. And then obviously when we
Exactly.
get down to thyroid hormone replacement, we'll talk about different interventions and different strategies and both mono and then dual therapy and some of the advantages and also the benefits of either or essentially.
Right. Yeah. Most of the T3, there's numerous different binding proteins. So there's a thyroxine binding globulin, and there's a
TBG.
prealbumin. Yep. And just albumin will bind, and T4 tends to bind to those proteins more tightly than T3. So when T3 is in, it's a kind of more of a direct highway to activating the thyroid receptor and turning on the metabolic processes that T3 does. So yeah, it's definitely bypassing that.
Absolutely.
What are we going to go to next? I was thinking
I'm,
about, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to take it over and go through the
Okay.
roles that thyroid hormone play in body composition and health improvement. So I'm going to
Okay.
do a brief overview of that, and then I'm going to lead it into you,
Gotcha.
my friend, because you're going to be
Okay.
much more in depth on the mechanisms of action. I'm just going to pepper in some facts along the way. But
Okay.
thyroid hormone plays an important role in both our body composition and our health improvement, and it does so in a variety of ways. So thyroid hormone interacts with every cell and tissue in the body, as I alluded to earlier, and it helps with the maintenance of metabolic rate and energy expenditure levels. It helps with heat production and body temperature regulation, which is why if you are suffering from hypothyroidism, you will notice that a lot of individuals, this could be yourself. I'll tell you personally, because I am someone that dealt with hypothyroidism. Before I was treated, I used to suffer from being cold all the time. It could be summer and I was constantly
Yeah.
shivering. It is regulated or it's involved in carbohydrate and fat metabolism. It's involved in insulin sensitivity as well as lipolysis. It's involved in protein turnover. So it has, especially T3 has effects on both protein synthesis, but also protein degradation and protein breakdown. It helps with oxygen uptake into tissues. It has a role in cholesterol metabolism and triglyceride degradation. So that is one actually thing that I see very commonly is that a lot of people that have subclinical or even clinical hypothyroidism, they will have an increase in cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels. They're not clearing those. Essentially, they're not going through cholesterol synthesis as well as cholesterol metabolism. We also see effects on bone metabolism. So this is something I've seen with women that have low bone mineral density, but they also happen to have relative energy deficiency, low energy availability. They've lost, menstrual cycle function, so they are hypothalamic amenorrheic. They also have low bone mineral density. So these are all, I want you guys to think about these cascades, that it's never, the body doesn't work in isolation. These are multifaceted downstream effects that happen from one of these axes being knocked down essentially. Thyroid also plays an important role in GI motility and bowel movement. So you'll notice if you do have a sluggish thyroid, oftentimes you're also going to have sluggish bowel movements. You're going to have constipation and things of that sort. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, very rarely have I had someone come to me in this condition, but there have been clients that have hyperthyroidism, so overactive thyroid, and they're
Mhm.
suffering from diarrhea. So it's the opposite end of the spectrum, rapid transport or motility
Right.
of the GI tract. So I want to go through a little bit about how thyroid downregulation impacts body composition. So we see in those that have hypothyroidism or downregulations in thyroid due to nutritional status or many other factors that we'll go through later, they can have a lower metabolic rate and energy expenditure. They're going to have lowered or impaired fat oxidation. They have decreased glucose uptake as well as decreased insulin sensitivity. They can have a decrease in recovery capacity. They could have downstream effects on lower muscle protein synthesis rates and reduce cardiac output. So now, my clients who are listeners of the show are very, body composition focused and muscle centric. So what we're going to do is I want to go through some of the effects, and this is where I'm going to turn this over to you, Scott. Um, they're going to be most interested in the effects that the thyroid has on body composition. So, Scott, if you could, let's go through how the thyroid affects areas like our metabolism, muscle mass, and then also muscle fiber type.
Okay. So one thing I think we haven't mentioned that's worth mentioning, at least tossing in here too, is we talked about, I'm not going to go through the whole podcast. We talked about fat burners, many of which were stimulants. So we talked about a lot of sympathomimetics, right? And this is a different system. So one thing when your body, for instance, is controlling your set point or your settling point or how the intervention points are activated, we talked about that, how your body,
We've talked about that off air, though.
yeah, we have, I couldn't remember if we talked about it on one of the podcasts. So the way in which the body sort of regulates what your basic quote unquote normal constitutive body fat is going to be is controlled in part by your sympathetic nervous system. So lipolysis is strongly controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. The thyroid system is obviously integrated with that, but we're talking about something that's different. So for someone who's thinking about, for instance, from a supplement standpoint, because this is piggybacking off fat burners, right? We're not suggesting people should be using thyroid hormone as a fat burner per se, but when you look at how you're going to target fat loss or what's going to go on, for instance, someone who's got prescribed thyroid replacement therapy to help support lipolysis, this is a different system. So if you're looking at different systems that support anabolism, you would use different supplements to do that. This is another system that's involved in maintaining your metabolic rate. So there's another system that we don't probably have time to get into either that's involved with this, and that's leptin, which is derived from adipose cells. So people have probably heard about leptin and ghrelin. Those two are kind of partnered together with one another. When your fat cells get larger, they release more leptin. That actually has an effect on your sympathetic nervous system in your brain, but that also interacts in numerous ways with thyroid hormone to control your metabolism. So I'm not sure where exactly, I could just kind of talk and kind of wander my way through some of these things.
Yeah, so let me direct the conversation a little bit. I'm going to
Yeah,
focus
please.
first on endogenous thyroid, like the role it plays in metabolism. We'll go through some of the effects, just the broad-based perspective, and then I'll
Mhm.
throw out some things, and then you're gonna I know because we've had many conversations. I know you'll be able to kind of elaborate more. So I'll go just from a natural physiological perspective. I always like starting natural first because I
Mhm.
do have to keep in consideration that a lot of people aren't going to use thyroid, but they also don't know like how thyroid works or what roles it plays. And so I want to really hone in on the importance of it. So for instance, if we look at thyroid and metabolism, it's going to be the master controller of our basal metabolic rate. So thyroid is heavily involved in both our energy expenditure and our metabolic function. So this is going to include metabolic rate, energy expenditure, mitochondrial health. So that's a big thing with churning over, ATP synthesis and things of that sort. How much you can eat and maintain your body composition on, and thermogenesis and increasing core body temperature. And Scott, you did allude to the fact that if someone does replace thyroid hormone, we will see an increase in metabolic rate. We often see it in
Oh,
resting
sure.
metabolic rate, even if they're just getting to physiological levels. So there's a study that I read a very long time ago, but they only saw about a 60 calorie increase in resting metabolic rate from going from hypothyroid to euthyroid. So back into thyroid balance, essentially, a healthy thyroid level from T4 replacement. However, here's the thing. These were also individuals that were dieting. So there were subclinical hypothyroid. However, if we actually look at, and this is where it's really interesting, people only look at numbers and they think, oh, it's only 60 calories. Now, here's the thing. If you actually look at a review by Mueller et al., they found that on average, at just the level of the BMR, in terms of metabolic adaptation, we see an average of 50 to 70 calorie decrease in resting metabolic rate. So what did thyroid hormone do? It offset that downregulation in resting metabolic rate from diet-induced metabolic adaptation. So this could be advantageous to just keep your basal metabolic rate back at baseline, even when being in a calorie deficit. Another thing that it does from a metabolism perspective, and this kind of goes back to what we discussed last podcast, is it increases our sensitivity to catecholamines. So that's going to be important because catecholamines are heavily involved in the process of lipolysis, which is the liberation and mobilization of fatty acids out of the fat cell. Then from a, if we look at muscle, it's involved in many actions on muscle. So we can look at thyroid as a broad-based perspective and what it does, but then also T3 has a lot of actions on muscle. So for instance, if we look at thyroid as a broad classification, it's going to play a massive role in optimizing muscle growth and body composition in a variety of ways. It's involved in skeletal muscle contraction. It's involved in strength. It's involved in glucose metabolism, insulin sensitivity, and nutrient partitioning. And then also from an energy production standpoint to fuel training. But then if we look specifically at T3, which is the active component of thyroid, we also see that it increases GLUT4 translocation within the muscle cell. So it's going to help with uptaking glucose and filling out those muscles. It binds to muscles. It helps to upregulate energy production in mitochondria. It's involved in UPC3, uncoupling essentially. And it also helps, and this is something you could probably expand on more than I can, it helps with fiber type shifting. So Scott, could you explain what it does in terms of fiber type shifting, where it takes from one fiber to another, because it's going to have a role in hypertrophy?
Right. Let me take a step back on all those things, because you listed off a massive number of things. And if we then were to say, what happens if you increase the metabolic rate or the activity level of skeletal muscle? What would you expect to happen to glucose uptake, to GLUT4, to mitochondrial biogenesis, for instance, to uncoupling protein? Basically, T3 is doing those things that go along with having a higher resting metabolic rate. So it's kind of one and the same almost to a certain degree. Yeah, I mean, thyroid, as to what role this plays, it may have a performance effect, but it does tend to shift muscle to producing more fast myosin. So there are different ways that you can fiber type muscle. It's really a misnomer to call red fibers the same as type 1 and white fibers the same as type 2. There are different ways you can type. That's an old system that was used in animals. You don't really look and see in humans like red and white fibers. What you would see in animals were muscles that were red in color and muscles that were more white, like one portion of the gastrocnemius on a rat is called the white gastroc. That's where that comes from. But when you do traditionally now, when you do fiber typing in skeletal muscles, you can look at the myosin isoforms. That's one of the contractile proteins, and determine which myosin isoforms are there. And those are type 1 and type 2 with the subtypes therein. And thyroid shifts, interestingly enough, towards a faster, so more of the type 2, which is the opposite of what would happen if you were less active. So this is one sort of kind of interesting thing, because if you become less active, you tend to have more type 2s.
But that's also, we have to put the caveat, that's because you're not stimulating those type 1s through low intensity contraction, essentially, like low intensity activities.
Yeah, I mean, if you like severe disuse will shift towards faster myosin expression in skeletal muscle. There's an interesting thing you can do, like with endurance athletes. You take someone who's like the marathon runner and say, okay, I don't want you to train for like 3 weeks. Run. Well, yeah, well, not just eliminate, detrain them.
Okay,
And
I've seen tapering research that has seen this as well.
Yeah, not even, well, I don't know if you're going to want to say, but taking and measure their vertical leap, they'll be like 10 inches when they're highly trained as endurance athletes. You can like almost double their vertical leap just by having them detrain, because the muscle gets faster, right? And their muscle power goes up. It's a detraining from the endurance adaptations, which they've driven by miles and miles of pounding the pavement. In this case, is marathon running.
Now, Scott, can you just briefly just differentiate between type 1 slow twitch fibers and then type 2 fast twitch fibers, and maybe the advantages of getting that faster shift, or that shift to a faster phenotype in terms of type 2 fibers, like potentially more hypertrophic response or potential?
That's a huge can of worms there. So another thing, people typically say type 1 slow twitch, type 2 fast twitch. Another way of fiber typing is to measure twitch properties. So you can do that in animals, and you use electrical stimulation. You measure force production when you send in a singular impulse, and you look at the twitch properties, how fast the time to peak tension is, the 1/2 relaxation time after peak tension. And so you can have slower, so fast twitch muscles, the force will go up real fast and come down real fast. Slow twitch muscles, it goes up slowly, comes down slowly. You don't get the same peak either relative to the amount of muscle mass that you've activated. That's one way of fiber typing, right? It's like we have red cars and we have red cars, blue cars, and we have trucks and we have sedans, right? There is an association absolutely between twitch and fiber typing using myosin, but that just assume that's always the case. For instance, this was something that we saw in my lab actually when I was in grad school. We did some privately funded research with endurance cyclists, and we were fiber typing them and measuring glycogen use when they were taking in carbohydrate during a pretty high effort exercise bout in the heat. And we were measuring succinate dehydrogenase activity. So that's a mitochondrial enzyme. So mitochondrial activity. Typically, you think is the type 1. Those are the slow twitch, endurance-oriented, high mitochondria. And we measured, these guys had a lot of type 2A fibers, almost no type 2X, because whatever type 2X they may have had, when they were activating them and training them, they were converted to type 2A. So those were basically the two fiber types they had. These guys, some of them had really good genetics for endurance cycling, so they were 70% type 1. But there were many examples of guys who had more mitochondria in their type 2 fibers than in their type 1s, right? That was just an adaptation to the type of cycling that they'd done. So it's not always the same. So the idea would be, like, one advantage would be of thyroid. Generally, you'll see, if you look in some but not all studies, you'll see, at least in the short term, greater fiber growth in those fibers, which we would call type 2, based on the myosin they have in there. And if then you were to use thyroid or be hyperthyroid, have extra thyroid, and shift your fiber type, which is something that I don't know at what time frame that happens with humans. You may have to be hyperthyroid for a period of time, such that you would lose so much muscle, you'd be just shooting yourself in the foot to do so. But if you could just magically glean from that effect on fiber type, just having more type 2 fibers, that might be something that's good for more muscle growth. You'll see a lot of good power lifters, good strength and power athletes, sprinters especially, they just got lots of type 2s. And those people tend to grow really well, they hypertrophy really well, because the type 2s seem to have a greater potential for growth. That seems to be their role too. When you look at activation patterns, they only get used when you do sprint, power, high tension type of activities. So when they get called upon, it means you got to produce a lot of force. And when you got to produce a lot of force, well, force is the main thing that's driving hypertrophy. So it makes sense that those cells would respond on hypertrophy better than the other ones, which basically aren't set up to deal with high tension. They're set up to deal with endurance type activities. But in order to cause that shift by, or the other way around, to have a shift and like lose type 2 fibers, you can have shifts between fiber types. Lyle McDonald did a YouTube video on this like a week or so ago, I think. And there's some review articles out there. Wilson et al.'s got a review article. You can see these shifts. It's a hard thing to do measured over time, but if you were to, for instance, be hypothyroid and then lose your type 2s because of that, that would be, losing type 2s would be the least of my concerns, really, being hypothyroid by that time. And yeah, because you would have all the other negative effects of having been hypothyroid. But that is one of the things that happens, is that thyroid tends to do that. So it's fascinating. The way I've sort of conceptualized that, and I've seen this study most in rats, is if you do have a situation maybe where an animal is really well fed and thyroid is really high, and these are rodents, so they're scurrying around and scavenging and trying to get in and out of places. They're very fast. They have very intermittent activity. A well-fed euthyroid animal is going to have plenty of type 1s, which is going to allow them to carry out that very scurrious type of intermittent activity. When rats move, they scramble. They're not like sloths, just kind of moving along at a slow pace. So I wonder to what extent there even has relevance to human beings as far as thyroid status and fiber type. So, but there's something potentially there. So
Absolutely.
That's a whole other topic.
That's another
Thanks
can
for
of worms.
rambling.
So I'm
Yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah.
bring us back in because I know
Okay,
that you
yeah,
and I have had 2 or 3 hour conversations. So for the sake of
yeah,
the audience, I'm going to keep it to essentially how thyroid gets downregulated. So we're going to go through different factors. I'm going to take
right.
over and go through how energy availability and essentially being an aggressive dieting impacts thyroid production. Then I'm also going to go through carbohydrate availability as well as carbohydrate intake and um, thyroid production and how it impacts the thyroidal axis. And then I'm also going to have you expand upon that as well. So when we look at energy availability and thyroid hormone, these are closely related entities. And so we see that when someone is in a state of low energy availability, they will see a downregulation in thyroid hormone production. Our thyroid is the master controller of our metabolic rate, and it governs our ability to burn calories. So if your thyroid production is lower and downregulated, your ability to burn calories and lose fat is going to be hindered, and it's going to make fat loss more difficult. And our thyroid production is highly responsive to energy availability. So how I like to conceptualize this, I describe this to a lot of the coaches that I mentor, is think about energy availability kind of like your car, is with gas. So you want to think about like gas and oil. If we don't put enough fuel into our bodies, our metabolism responds and adapts by slowing everything down, including our thyroid production and its conversion. Just like our car would stop running as well without adequate fuel supply as well as oil in it. And so, for example, we see in aggressive dieting studies that dropping someone into a state of low energy availability can decrease thyroid production even within a short period of time. So, for example, in a landmark study by Dr. Ann Laux, who was essentially the first researcher to really investigate the effects of low energy availability, she compared an energy availability of 30 calories per kilogram of body weight and then dropped females into a massive deficit where they only ate at 8 calories per kilogram of body weight. And this study found that after only 4 days of this extreme low energy availability diet, T3 levels had reduced by 15% and free T3 levels had decreased by 18%, whereas reverse T3 increased by 24%. So we see all of these down regulations in the system essentially. And keep in mind, what we have to realize is that these women were in a very drastic and aggressive diet. So if I did the conversions for you and I thought about the average client that I have, a woman that's 120 pounds, this would be a daily calorie intake of 432 calories.
Right.
So
Yeah,
this is drastic what they're doing to these women. And that's why
starvation.
we have to really
Diet.
conceptualize the fact that these are extreme studies, but they're looking for an effect essentially. So we wouldn't really extrapolate that out to the real world, but there are people that take very drastic approaches to dieting. And so we see that being in a state of low energy availability can decrease T3 up to 30%. And we also see in the REDS literature that athletes with amenorrhea, so the loss of the menstrual cycle, show consistent decreased T3 levels. So this is something you see broad across all the hypothalamic amenorrhea literature, as well as the relative energy deficiency in sport literature. We also see that one of the hormonal adaptations associated with diet-induced metabolic adaptation from significant weight loss is a decrease in thyroid production. Now, keep in mind, this is not going to be as drastic as the relative energy deficiency literature because these are individuals, generally women, that have been in an extended state of low energy availability. But during an extensive period of being in a deficit, the HPT axis adapts to essentially reduce energy expenditure. And one ways that it does this is by lowering thyroid production, which is involved in both your basal metabolic rate and energy expenditure, which is why we see two of the biggest metabolic adaptations. We see something specifically called adaptive thermogenesis, where we see a downregulation in 24-hour energy expenditure. And one of those components of that 24-hour energy expenditure, or that total daily energy expenditure, is your basal metabolic rate. So, for example, in a review on adaptive thermogenesis by Rosenbaum and Leibel, they found that clinically significant weight loss of 10% of body weight or more led to a 7% reduction in T3 levels and then a 9% reduction in T4 levels. And so we're seeing not as drastic as the relative energy efficiency because these are people in a general diet. But if you were to lose a clinically significant amount of weight, we could see down regulations in thyroid production. Now, we also see that nutrient status and specifically carbohydrate intake and carbohydrate availability impacts thyroid production both during a deficit, but this can also occur when you're eating at maintenance, but are on a very low carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet for a prolonged period of time. So very low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet can exacerbate the downregulation of our thyroid hormone production, both in an energy deficit. So that is to be expected because when you're going into a state of reduced calorie intake, you're in a negative energy balance. We're going to see downregulations to thyroid production as well as thyroid conversion. But what a lot of people don't realize is we could see similar effects or a downregulation in thyroid production even when eating at maintenance if you do not have sufficient carbohydrate availability. So if we look at what happens during a fat loss phase, where you're in an energy deficit, we see a downregulation in thyroid hormone production and conversion of T4 to metabolically active T3. And that's for a variety of reasons. So I do want to explain that as the start. So essentially, we see downregulations in thyroid production as well as thyroid conversion from T4 to T3 because of the calorie deficit itself. Also, another confounding factor that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to is we also see it due to a lack of micronutrients in the diet, like selenium, iodine, and zinc, that are necessary cofactors for proper thyroid hormone production and synthesis. And why I hit on this is because I do a full dietary overview. When someone comes to me, I look at their previous diets and I do a diet log and essentially a diet analysis. And a lot of times I'm seeing many micronutrient deficiencies, and then their blood work reflects that. But the thing is that these people come to me and they have a history of dieting, but they've not only just created a calorie deficit, but also a micronutrient deficit because they've essentially taken a suboptimal approach to dieting phases. Now, the other component that many people overlook that can contribute to reductions in thyroid hormone production is due to a lack of carbohydrates. So that can be a low carbohydrate diet, a ketogenic diet, anything that you're not getting sufficient carbohydrate availability. So we have research that shows that even if a person isn't in a deficit, thyroid production, specifically T3, which is metabolically active form of thyroid hormone, can be downregulated when someone is following a ketogenic diet due to the fact that they're consuming chronically low levels of carbohydrates. So, for example, in a study, and this is the study that I was referring to with you on our last call, it's by Finney et al. They had participants follow a balanced baseline diet at maintenance calories for a week. And this diet included a balanced amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Then what they did was they transitioned them into a 4-week ketogenic diet where they had them eat at their maintenance calorie intake, but they cut their carbs down to 20 grams of carbohydrates or less per day. And what they did was they made an isocaloric swap. So they essentially took the amount of carbohydrates that they reduced from the diet and they just replaced that with dietary fat. Now, throughout the 4 weeks of the ketogenic period, they monitored their body weight to make sure that they didn't lose any weight, as the goal was to see the effects of a ketogenic diet at maintenance calories. So keep in mind, this is not confounded by the fact that these individuals lost weight or were in energy deficit because they were eating at maintenance and they stayed at energy balance essentially, and they maintained their weight. And they also, this is another great part of the study that a lot of people overlook, is throughout the course of the study, they also supplemented them with vitamins and minerals so they weren't suffering from any micronutrient deficiencies that would impact their hormone levels. And what they found was that during each week on the ketogenic diet, the participants' T3 levels dropped more and more. And by the end of the study, T3 had decreased by close to 50% in just 4 weeks, even though they weren't in a deficit, they didn't lose any weight. So it wasn't due to being in the deficit and in a state of low energy availability, but more so because of the lack of carbohydrates and having been put into a state of low carbohydrate availability. So when you go true keto, your T3 drops as a result of inducing a state of low carbohydrate availability, not due to the energy deficit. So the carb intake of your diet and your thyroid production are closely related, as if you're not eating a sufficient amount of carbohydrates for an extended or prolonged period of time, it can downregulate thyroid hormone production and conversion. And this is due to multiple levels. Scott, we could discuss leptin signaling. We could talk about insulin signaling. These are all things cascades to the brain that are signaling energy availability and also essentially giving the hypothalamus the signals that it is in a good state to be able to produce thyroid hormone. But I know that there's another study that you're well versed in, which is Danforth, and it also looks at a very similar relationship, essentially looking at different dietary conditions.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, I think it's important just to kind of a takeaway for that is that someone goes on a ketogenic diet, let's say, and maybe they're just adapting to the low carb and they haven't done one before. They're going to give it a shot, right? Hopefully they're going to do a cyclical ketogenic diet, just not do it like an Atkins the entire time. It's not going to work well. Not going to be able to train very well doing that. You need some carbs for the glycogen. You're going to expect per se that your thyroid levels are going to drop more than they would otherwise on a higher carb diet. That doesn't necessarily mean, oh shoot, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. This ketogenic thing doesn't work for me. One of the theoretical ideas, and this is maybe jumping ahead, but we talked about thyroid is basically it's revving our metabolism. So it's increasing catabolism like lipolysis, and it does increase protein synthesis to some degree. It's shifting protein synthesis. So of course, talking about that fiber type shift, for instance, it's going to increase the, the the protein synthesis of type 2 myosin. That's how it would cause that fiber type shift. But it's also increasing protein breakdown. So one thing that might help those people who find that if they have some type of anti-catabolic effect, this is highly controversial, but the thought would be that maybe something about being in a low carbohydrate availability state, it might help to preserve muscle mass in that case by having less thyroid around. And we know that the converse of that is that if, and we were going to get to this too, is if someone becomes hyperthyroid, especially if they're dieted down before a contest and they start throwing the thyroid in there as a last ditch minute effort to drop fat, they're going to lose a lot of muscle mass really quickly, potentially at least. So yeah, the other study is I have it here in front of me, the Stanford study from 1979. Basically, it shows the interesting thing about it, just to sort of summarize it all, is they compared a fast, like one of the comparisons that was made in the study was a fast versus a no carbohydrate diet, same sort of thing for 7 days. And you saw a drop in T3 that was basically the same or very, very close to being the same. So no calories whatsoever versus just reducing carbohydrate. So the interesting thing there is that this tells you to what extent carbohydrate plays a role in the T3 conversion, thyroid hormone output, and those sorts of things. So expect that it's going to happen with a ketogenic diet. Now, if someone were to, for instance, say, you know, I see it drops a lot, maybe I need to do a ketogenic diet where I carb up more often because it's too much. Instead of doing like 1 day of carbing up, they're doing like a 1 on, 6 off, or 6 on, 1 off with a weekend carb up. Maybe they need to find a different structure, and they could use their thyroid hormone blood work in order to guide them in that sense. Say, you know what, if I do 2 carb up days spread throughout the week, the drop in thyroid compared to a comparative diet that I did my previous diet, previous year's contest or previous year's photo shoots or what have you, then this is better for me. I need to carb up more. So there's something to say there. Yes.
That leads me right into the next topic, my friend, because this is
Okay.
something that I asked you privately about that I wanted to discuss. So, really, what I
Okay.
wanted to get your thoughts on, I'm going to give you some of my, I guess, my theory crafting from all the years that I've been
Okay.
doing this and what I've seen. I'm going to give you my theory, and then I would like your thoughts. And I always want you. We have normal conversations off air. I would like your honest and objective feedback. So, what I
Okay.
wanted to go through is the interaction between carbohydrate intake and thyroid production levels. And I'll tell you just from a broad perspective, I'm a big believer in utilizing intermittent dieting strategies. So that can be carbohydrate refeeds, that can be diet breaks. And then I also have a strategy that I use personally with my own one-on-one clients, which I refer to as a deficit deload. And I do this with clients who are dieting and trying to get lean. And based on the relationship between carbohydrate intake and its effects on both thyroid production and increasing leptin levels, especially in comparison to fat, I personally believe that we can improve thyroid production both during and after fat loss phases by increasing the carbohydrate intake of the diet and increasing calories at least back to maintenance, if not beyond that. And this is a strategy I've been using with clients for close to a decade now. And it's come from seeing an improvement in my clients' body composition, their biofeedback, as well as their fat loss efficiency. So when they're not in these refeed perspectives, I see them be more responsive when we get back into the deficit. It's almost like it brings back life to them. It resets them. They're refreshed. They're more adherent, but also physiologically, they just seem to train better. They just seem to have higher energy expenditure levels. They're able to keep their need up. So there's both physiological, but also psychological things. But I will say that there is some research that I base this on, but we're going to have to go back to get this research because keep in mind that when I first started using this high carbohydrate refeeding strategy, this was before any of the refeed or diet break research that was done, much of just within the last 4 years or so. I mean, Bill Campbell's study, I believe, on refeeds, back-to-back refeeds came out in 2020. Jackson Peel's was 2021. Madeline Seidler's diet break study was just 2023. So I got to go even further back, but I'm going to give you the impetus or really what got me thinking on this so you could see maybe my conceptual overview from the mechanistic perspective, and then we
Mm-hmm.
can go back and forth because I know you're going to be familiar with the research that I'm going to bring up. So the first study essentially that got me into thinking about this was I had and you know this personally, I have a very big interest in metabolic adaptation. And so I was looking at extreme dieting trials. So there was a study, the first study that I ever looked at that kind of gave me the impetus, like maybe I should start utilizing this refeeding strategy. And I wanted to make it particularly carbohydrates, was a study from Friedel and colleagues, where they took a group of young, healthy men and they put them through essentially an Army Ranger program. These were volunteers and they
Mhm.
put them through the gambit. So throughout the study, they had what they referred to as a multi-stress environment, which this was, I mean, it was brutal. Scott, I know you're familiar with that study, and it was,
Yeah.
high sustained workload. So they were working throughout the entire course of the day. They gave them inadequate sleep, and then they also put them in well over 1,000 calorie deficit. Now, within this study, what they did was they divided the individual participants up into two groups. So one dieted straight through. So that is what we would consider, or we would refer to now as the continuous dieting group. Then they also had a group that had refeeds, which now we would refer to that as the intermittent dieting group. So this is 2000. So they didn't have those terms in
Mhm.
the study, but I'm
Mhm.
just going to give the classifications as a 2024.
Right.
So when we look at the group without refeeds, after 8 weeks, these individuals reached very low body fat levels, and their serum T3 levels were below normal. They also saw the same thing for testosterone as well. They also found that their free T3 and their free testosterone levels were further reduced by increases in specific binding proteins in response to the declines in insulin levels. Now, this is what we saw in that continuous dieting group. But they found that in the refeed group, due to refeeding, even with the continuation of the other stressors, so they had the sustained high workload, they had the inadequate sleep, those in the refeed group produce prompt recovery of T3, testosterone, and IGF-1 levels. So since the intermittent refeeds led the refeed group to consume a higher energy intake over the cumulative dieting period, it essentially attenuated the subclinical hypothyroidism that the continuous group experienced. So in the group that didn't refeed, they essentially saw T3 tank from being in a high stress state and also an aggressive deficit. But in the refeed group, they did see T3 tank, but during just 1 week of going back to a refeeding period, they saw that restored, as well as they saw testosterone restored. Now, the reason I have specifically done these refeeds and increased the calories from carbohydrates specifically is because of the fact that carbohydrates are the macronutrient that have the largest effect on leptin levels. And leptin provides feedback to the arcuate nucleus that helps with central regulation of thyroid hormone production. We also see in studies that compare calorie matched overfeeding from either carbohydrates or fats that carbs have a greater effect on both increasing leptin and then also 24-hour energy expenditure. So, for example, there's a famous study, I know you're familiar with it, and no, I love these overfeeding studies. So, this is by
Right.
Derlewanger, and they compared 3 days of carbohydrate and fat overfeeding in healthy females. And they found that the carbohydrate overfeeding trial that was 3 days in length led to a 28% increase in leptin levels and a 7% increase in 24-hour energy expenditure levels. Whereas the fat overfeeding, despite being calorie matched, they got the same overfeeding amount. It did
Mhm.
not produce significant increases or changes in leptin concentrations and energy expenditure. So, Scott, really what I'm trying to give you the mechanisms, what was going through my brain when I started doing this. I can give you
Right.
the
Sure.
anecdotal experience, but I'll give you the research first and foremost. And I'd love to get your thoughts on leveraging high carb days or refeeds for restoring thyroid hormone production, even if it's transient, but just to get essentially a restoration and a refreshment. We also have to think about the other mechanisms. It can help with glycogen restoration, better training performance, increased NEAT levels, like all these other downstream effects. But I would love your feedback on that, essentially this approach, and if you think there's any efficacy in it.
I've been doing the same thing for quite a long time myself too, since over 20 years, to be honest. It just always made sense. I was playing around with cyclical ketogenic diets in the 90s. In the late 90s, there was a listserv with Lyle McDonald's on there, a couple other people, and I ran every type of cyclical ketogenic diet refeed I could come up with. Like the patterns were all over the place. Low carb and then high carb, like targeted ketogenic diet where you carb up around your workout or right before their workout and then during the workout and then just on the weekends and every 10 days, twice during the week, you name it. The thing about that Friedel study that's just interesting is they saw the same if they just stopped that study and they looked at the end and said, okay, so what happened? How did we the T3 tank as much? Did we prevent the reduction in T3 by having the refeeds throughout the stress period? And the answer would be like, no, it looks the same, but their recovery was faster, right? So there's something going on there, and that's sort of the unknown mechanism maybe, which could be epigenetic in nature. Basically, this intermittent signaling that there is nutrient availability, and this is the thing I think I said in email. This seems like there would be, and this is total teleologic thinking here. it seems like mechanistically, evolutionarily, it would make sense for the system to have some way of noting that there is not going to be a prolonged lack of energy availability. And that when energy is again available, that it can make use of it in some way, shape, or form. So, for instance, the other thing that's interesting too, we have to kind of consider is that if you just give exogenous, this is jumping ahead, I think you're going to cover this in another section, but if, for instance, we just give T3, just a single dose of T3, and it will elevate blood levels. They'll peak in maybe 3-4 hours. It kind of depends on which study you've looked at. The half-life numbers, they'll have to talk about that, but it's in and out of the system, and it depends on whether you're looking at elimination half-life or terminal half-life, or what's going on in terms of the actual pharmacokinetics of how the T3 comes up and comes back down again. T3 levels in the body don't necessarily reflect then what happens in terms of metabolic rate. A spike in T3 from a single dose will manifest in an elevation of metabolic rate a couple of days later, right? So getting a spike in T3 or an elevation in T3 can have a prolonged effect. So, and T4 is, of course, the more relevant because that's what the body's going to be putting out. T4 has a much longer half-life. You give a large dose of T4, it might be 10 days until you see an elevation of metabolic rate. So there's a time scale here that's also difficult to tease out in these studies and some of these intermittent dieting studies, which you know better than I, the ones that come out in the last 4 or 5 years, as you noted. So I think there's a couple things that are going on. One, we've got leptin, which can be increased in like 5, 6, 7, 10 hours for sure. You can have just a quick refeed, 2 or 3 meals or half of a day, and you can get an elevation in leptin. And like you said, leptin has effects on the brain, and T3 has effects on these deiodinase enzymes. It has effect. There's multiple interactions between thyroid affecting leptin and leptin affecting thyroid. So those are buddies, and they're colluding to control our metabolic rate. So while you won't necessarily see, like our topic now is thyroid, you won't necessarily see that if you do a day refeed that you get this massive level increase in thyroid per se. But if you do see an elevation in leptin, that can happen in a much shorter time frame, and leptin then is increasing action of thyroid. For instance, by increasing deiodinase enzymes that are producing more T2, which typically isn't even considered to be an active thyroid metabolite, right? This kind of goes under the radar. You can have lipolysis that's brought on by leptin, and you see this sort of long-term post-dieting fat loss effect. I think Lyle McDonald has talked about this.
It's the long-term delayed fat loss
delayed
effect.
fat loss
Essentially,
effect.
that
Yeah.
is the concept that even after a diet is done, oftentimes we see individuals as they increase calories, and we're not talking about overfeeding and trying to rebound. It's you're
Right.
steadily increasing calories. Essentially, we're seeing a loss in water, we're seeing a decrease in cortisol, we're seeing the whoosh effect, which is something that I've covered on a full podcast, where essentially we see a dissipation of water and stress and fluid retention, but also there could be this long-term delay in actual fat loss where it essentially it's like a super compensatory effect where we actually see it materialize itself. So I've done this in what I refer to as a metabolic restoration phase with clients, where I'm essentially I'm looking to increase all aspects of their energy expenditure, both nutritionally, supplementation wise, and I'm also increasing their step count. And so I'm getting them into a state of what I refer to as higher energy flux. And so all systems are kind of upregulating their BMR, their thermic effective eating because they're eating more, their exercise activity thermogenesis because they have more, more energy coming into the system, more energy they could put out in terms of their training volume, in terms of their
Right.
training output, their training intensity. And also their NEAT levels are going up just due to the fact that they have more energy. So they're not
Time.
slogging on the couch like a sloth anymore. And
Yeah.
so, yes, what you're referring to is very, it's something that I don't see a lot of times in the literature because they're not looking at those body composition results, like what happens in the week after we finish a dieting study. But I will tell you, as something that's in the trenches, I've coached well over 1,000 people at this point. I've seen it many of times, and it
Yep.
really does take a client buying into the process, also following it to a T. But there are some very interesting effects that we can see from a body composition and a cosmetic perspective, where once muscle glycogen fills out, it's almost the same effect of, I'm sure you remember where we used to just do 1-day refeeds. And it was almost like you couldn't overeat in that refeed if you did it from whole
No.
foods, carbohydrate base. You could have a massive carbohydrate overfeeding, and it's like, I'm still losing fat. Like, it's amazing. But this is where it's a tightrope to walk, because that one day it often becomes 2 to 3, and then all of a sudden you start spilling over
Yeah,
into fat
that doesn't
storage.
happen
And there's
forever.
even certain studies that look at carbohydrate overfeeding to see the maximum glycogen uptake, or essentially glycogen storage. And we see in one study that they were able to increase glycogen storage up to 15 grams per kilogram, which is immense. Because if you think about the average individual, 70-kilogram man has probably between 400 and 500
Carbs.
grams of stored glycogen in muscle, and between 80 to 100 grams of glycogen stored in liver. So if we really did the calculations, 15 times, a 70-kilogram individual would be well over 1,000 grams. So we went from someone, theoretically only being able to store, say, 500 grams of glycogen to over double that. But it's really in certain physiological conditions that we can see this.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's also that may play a role for some of the listeners too, depending on how hard you train, how much you train. If you're someone who tends to get sore, there's actually and this was a muscle damage study. I think you and I have talked this before, but they gave 1,000 grams of carbs a day, and they basically weren't even able to budge muscle glycogen a bit because there was so much
Blocked
muscle
uptake.
there. Yeah, block the uptake or the increase in metabolic rate, just covering the repair effect, that like the nutrients were directed, or there's depressed energy status because of the repair processes, such that the glycogen just wasn't being formed. The energy was needed just to repair the muscle so it could function again. Fuel would be sort of secondary in that case, the inflammatory process, blah blah blah. So yeah, so you've got the short-term effects like that one. I really love that phenomenon of like carbing up, for one day. And, when you try to consider how much is going to glycogen, you can have 4,000 or 5,000 calories in a day, which is way beyond your expenditure, your RMR, but you're actually in a deficit because so many of those grams of carbs are going to skeletal muscle. But then over time, you've got also this potential long-term delayed fat loss effect, which may be related to thyroid, may be related to leptin involvement as well. So that's something you see, like you see people and people love to brag about this too. This is one of the biggest bragging rights. Sometimes you see it after a show, they call it their off season, and they're like 10 days post show, right?
And they jump in
Or,
another show.
right. Well, and that can work. Like that can be work
Absolutely.
really well. Yes, smart to do so. You look better jumping another show. But when people have dieted really, really hard, and then a smart coach says, "Okay, let's start to slowly bring your calories back up," and they continue to get leaner.
So I'll
So
tell you personally, what I like to do is I like to have my guys, whether it's a competitor or a photo shoot, prep clients. I work with a lot of lifestyle clients or other fitness professionals. I like to have them ready 2 weeks early, and then I start feeding them up slowly, bringing down
sure.
cardio, getting them into more of a parasympathetic state and taking stress off the system. And I often find that they get better over time. They continue getting leaner despite their calories going up. So I'm essentially walking their calories up, decreasing stress, decreasing inflammation, decreasing water retention. And then also, as they see themselves looking better, they're pushing harder in the gym. They feel more confident. They're less stressed, especially in the context of a photo shoot where I'm taking many people through their first photo shoot prep. They're very nervous, but we have that 2 week buffer. And I always tell clients, I'm like, listen, if you think you're going to be ready in 16 weeks, we're doing 18 weeks. If it's 18 weeks, it's 20 weeks. I always give that buffer room. That is, I'm always telling them, if we're 18 weeks out, you're 16 weeks out. Because those last 2 weeks that I'm essentially pulling stress off the system, and I use what I call a push-pull method, essentially, which is like an advanced fat loss method where I push people, then I pull them back. I utilize refeed or deficit deload strategies. I've already practiced this with them throughout the course of the fat loss phase. So then I know those last 2 weeks, what type of buffering room they have from a caloric and a carbohydrate standpoint. And it just works beautifully in terms of taking stress off the system, just getting them into a relaxed state where the day before they look their best. I don't have to go and do this exorbitant carb load where they're feeling gastrointestinal distress, because I took the last 2 weeks and essentially filled them out throughout the time course of that.
I will say there's another thing that I've got literally decades of experience playing with myself and with clients. The way I typically do peak week, and I've done numerous podcasts. We haven't talked about this here, I don't think directly, but the way I do peak week almost universally makes people leaner the week after they've done that. So that's basically, you start off the week, you don't try to go into a deficit per se, you just eliminate carbs to create a mild depletion effect to prep insulin sensitivity in the muscles for about a 2-day carb up, a day and a half, depends on the person. Some people need 2,500 grams of carbs. Some people can do it in 1,000, depends on the person, the weight. And then they have the day before the show where they drop whatever water they need to, and then they wake up and they sort of, refine things as needed on the show. But that's Monday, Monday and Tuesday, no carbs, maybe Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, no carbs.
Scott, are we talking zero carbohydrates?
I mean, you're going to have some vegetables in there. You're not just doing oil and meat and, and butter and, not even cheese. Low carbs. You're basically
Okay.
dropping down to, 100
You're doing
grams
a
of carbs
depletion
or less.
and then you're essentially filling out intramuscular triglycerides with higher fat content, correct?
That's one of the things that can happen there is you can get a fat loading effect. That depends on the person, and that's one thing you can tease around. The main idea is you're going to get your most bang for your buck in terms of loading carbohydrate. So the idea is to have a mild reduction in carbohydrate because you're doing your normal training over those Saturday, Monday, or Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So you're training the whole body. You're just not replenishing whatever glycogen that you've used up. But you're not trying to intentionally deplete to like 0 grams of carb or 0 carbs in your muscle. But you can add fat then. You're not trying to lose fat in those days. It's mainly prepping for the glycogen load. But you can fat load then. And then the day before the show, when you drop the carbs, which will help with water loss, you can fat load again too. You could do both cases. Some people do really well with that. It depends to some degree what the diet was like preceding. So if someone was on a really high carb, low fat diet, fats get used during resistance exercise. They're probably used to restore energy status. They're not providing energy per se in any large amount during the actual exercise, but during the rest intervals, they're getting used up to restore phosphocreatine indirectly, et cetera, restoring energy status. So, but when people do that, they're concerned like, oh, I'm missing a week of dieting. I'm like, I actually do that to speed up people's diet. If we're 5 weeks out and I think they're lean enough at least where I can see whether it made a difference running through that rigor. And I do this a lot of times, not because it's absolutely magical, although it is really nice to see what happens when you really fill somebody up who's not used to that. Would you really just make them bursting at the seams until they fill and spill? But I do that because sometimes to calm their nerves for numerous reasons, but sometimes just because it almost universally means a leap forward in terms of fat loss. So they don't lose a week because they have this massive 1.5 days of carbing. So like say Wednesday morning through Thursday midday might be typical. It depends on the person. They actually end up being leaner come the next Monday afterwards. And I had a friend of mine who I've helped numerous times. And I think he did that. He just dieted basically the whole show that way for like 12 weeks. I think he did like 8 or 9 peak week practices because it worked really well. He was just training 3 days and then he'd come in and do a practice show and he was able to hold on to his muscle mass doing that. He got really lean and he got ready early. He's like, I don't have any more fat loss to lose. I'm going to futz around with my peak week just for fun and see if I can optimize some stuff. So he changed the food around. He played around with when he discontinued his water consumption the day before, et cetera, et cetera. But back to the conversation at hand, that was a cyclical ketogenic diet, not necessarily clinically ketogenic in terms of macronutrients on those first 3 days, but it's a low carb diet with a carb refeed that works really, really well for people in terms of fat loss. The purpose is peak week, but it actually accelerates fat loss compared. And this is the thing that makes me think about this. And I've thought of this many times. It's like, what the hell am I doing wrong with the dieting? We should be doing more carb ups. We could be doing more of this because this works better than the dieting. And I include carb ups with my clients dieting. I include carbs around workouts and then refeeds if necessary. I mean, I mix it up totally depending on the person. Some people,
Yes. So
it's
I do a
very,
little bit
very
different
highly,
than you.
yeah.
I'm not utilizing ketogenic into the high carb refeeds. I'm utilizing, say, a moderate carbohydrate diet, high protein diet, lower fat diet, and then I'm going into the high carbohydrate refeeds. But same type of
Yeah.
essentially the same I guess reason. I'm looking essentially there's many mechanisms. When I'm seeing glycogen restoration, we're increasing glycogen content, we're having better training performance. But then also when I was thinking about the mechanisms, I think about leptin and the fact that carbs are going to be the biggest input for leptin hormone signaling. And if you look at Lauk's work, she really has this theme that her theory is that it's not only for, especially for women with hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is a big subsect that I work with. I work with a lot of women that are lean that want to get leaner, and I'm trying to preserve their menstrual cycle. because many
Sure.
of them have come to me with 3. I have women up to 9 years having lost their cycle and I've restored it. And so I'm very cognizant when I'm taking them through a dieting phase, like, listen, you've already been here previously. You're more predisposed towards the effects of
Mhm.
low energy availability. So let's try to rectify the approach that we take going forward. And many times they come to me from a ketogenic or a low carbohydrate diet approach. And they also had various micronutrient deficiencies, many things that we had to work through during a longer, like primer, what I call a primer phase. But I think about it from a leptin signaling perspective and the fact that we want, and really in Lauk's work, looking at low energy availability and really hormone regulation from that, from the hypothalamus, is that the hypothalamus is looking at both, energy availability and then also carbohydrate availability. And leptin is essentially the energy regulator of this of the cell, essentially in the brain. And so
Mhm.
when there's adequate carbohydrate availability from those refeeds, especially during, you've been in a deficit, but then I'm taking you back up to maintenance. So now we're back at eucaloric balance, we're back at energy balance. You're getting the signal of energy availability, but then I'm also doing it predominantly. Say someone's in a hypothetical 500 calorie deficit, all 500 calories I'm increasing just from carbohydrates. So we're getting a
Ooh.
bump in 125 grams of carbohydrates. That's increasing leptin. And then also, so we're getting the signal from energy availability. You're back at maintenance. You're not in a deficit. Your body is not sensing that energy deprivation, first and foremost. Then I'm doing it through carbohydrates. Then we're getting the insulin signaling. We're getting the leptin signaling to the brain. And now we're in a good state of glucose and carbohydrate availability. And I feel like, and this is actually one of Lauk's theories, is that that provides the brain with the status that there's both good energy availability and good carbohydrate availability. And from there, the hypothalamus can start that signaling cascade to kickstart the production of thyroid by releasing TRH, which goes down to pituitary. Then we get the stimulation of TSH,
Yeah.
and then it's going to go down to thyroid gland to release T4 and T3. And we also know that insulin, as well as carbohydrates, are involved in the conversion of T4 to T3. So there's all these different mechanisms where we can
Mhm.
really leverage this. Not every coach is thinking about that, but you and I really like to dig into these things. And that's always
Yeah.
something that I see in the literature, but then also I've done it so many times with people. It's like, that I've seen the effects both physiologically, psychologically, and then also when I look at their lab work, generally when I take an approach like this, I utilize an intermittent dieting strategy, or I keep carbohydrates a little bit more readily available, especially peri-workout, which is something that you and I have discussed many times. Actually, our first podcast ever was on nutrient timing, and I think we got to do a round 2 on that because it's been many
Okay.
years, my friend. And there's
Okay.
there's much new literature on that. However, I see better blood work in comparison to when they came to me before. Now, keep in mind that these are individuals that dieted themselves or utilize another coach. And so I'm looking at their post diet lab work from a different condition. But
Right.
we're going to discuss this a little bit later. Some of the approaches that many coaches, even those with big names, are taking right now are disadvantageous. They might look good from a body composition perspective, but their hormonal health and their lab markers look horrendous. So really
Mhm.
what I'm trying to do is optimize physiology, but also provide them with maybe a more health centric approach where there's more, longevity within this.
Yeah. Something that the listeners can maybe keep in mind, a different way of thinking about this is what carbohydrate kind of signals and means to the body. One thing is that when we're talking about just from an evolutionary perspective or from a human performance perspective, carbs are the way to go. If you want to be able to fight or flight or perform high intensity efforts,
Preferred fuel
carbohydrates,
substrate.
our metabolic machinery is geared to use carbohydrate to produce ATP at a rapid rate. So it's not only like the metabolism doesn't really have much of a choice. It's kind of preferred, but it's the only one that's going to work because the enzymatic machinery just can't produce the ATP fast enough with fat. But then from in terms of sending information back to the brain, and that signal through leptin, carbohydrate, et cetera, if fat were that signal, then the body would have to figure out, this is just a very rudimentary way of thinking about it. The body was going to have to figure out, well, are these fatty acids coming from the lipolysis that we've already got up and running because we need to rely on fats for energy because we're in a caloric deficit? Or are these fats coming from an exogenous source? So maybe the level of the fatty acids, they're probably obviously going to be higher when you take in a high fat meal. But in terms of what is the more sensible signal to react to in the brain, free fatty acids, which let's say you go and you do exercise, right? You do endurance exercise and you turn on lipolysis and you elevate fatty acids and free fatty acids and bound fatty acids. And then the brain says, oh shit, there's tons of energy around. It's like, No, actually, we're just using up energy. We needed that, right? It's not going to necessarily, there would be a mechanism. I'm sure there would be circumstances evolutionary where the body could adapt this. Probably species have done this, but those free fatty elevation from that situation doesn't mean there's plenty of fat around. That's just what the body did when it liberated its own free fatty acids. To differentiate those free fatty acids from free fatty acids coming from the diet would be a pretty tricky thing to do, perhaps. The body, I'm sure, could figure this out. A much more simpler signal to react to are incoming carbohydrates. We do get an elevation of blood glucose when you do like high endurance exercise. You get the liver will pump out a little more glucose and it'll go high, but you're not getting an elevation of glucose like when you eat a piece of fruit or a piece of bread or you have a high carbohydrate meal. That's a clear signal to the body like, okay, there's incoming food, carbohydrate, that tells us, okay, well, maybe we don't have to defend our body fat set point, if there is such a thing, as much because there's food coming in. And it's the type of food, it's glucose, which is going to allow us to do what we need to do to get more food, to hunt and perhaps gather. If we have to gather at a rapid rate, of course you can gather slowly using fat, but at least to fight or flight, etc. So carbohydrates, it makes sense that our bodies would have sort of engineered themselves around carbohydrate being the signal that says, okay, we don't have to worry about fat loss so much. It's providing energy that we can actually use in situations that are going to help with our survival. So that's just a way to sort of think about why carbs are maybe better than fat during a refeed, because carbs just it sends a different signal, telling a different story to the body, I think, from a macronutrient perspective.
Without a doubt. So Scott, we got
Yeah.
10 minutes left, my friend, before my
Okay.
next call. So what we're going to do is
All
I'm
right.
going to skip down because there was one topic that we had many. We were going to go through thyroid hormone replacement. I'll eventually do that on another podcast. And then the
Okay.
pharmacokinetics and dynamics of thyroid. We're going to skip those. The one thing I do want to cover, and this is something you and I have went back and forth on,
Yeah.
both off air, and this is really the catabolic effects of taking excess T3. So the last thing I want us to cover is that topic because I know this is something that we've discussed previously, but I've had a lot of clients who have come to me from other coaches, and it's evident that a lot of coaches these days are using T3 in excess to drive fat loss, drive lipolysis essentially. But really, I'm looking at the full program now, mind you. I'm not just looking at their thyroid levels and their blood work. I'm also looking at the full protocol that they're using. And what it's really become clear, and this is something that you also related to me on, is that a lot of times coaches are just kind of like throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks, essentially. They're not taking the scientific method. They're not using things in isolation. They don't know even the downstream impacts and negative effects of these things. But a lot of times they're trying to utilize different drugs, especially thyroid, to make up for suboptimal approaches to dieting clients to low levels of body fat. And just
Right.
within the last, say, 6 to 12 months, I've seen some of the most ridiculous and honestly horrendous T3 doses and protocols. So I think it's important to cover this because T3 increases protein turnover. So yes, it does increase protein synthesis, but it also massively, especially when you go into a hyperthyroidal state, it's going to increase protein degradation and breakdown. It can be catabolic in high doses. So can we discuss that a little bit? Because a lot of times people, and I don't want to make us to make this mistake. A lot of times we'll talk about T3. There's many benefits as we just covered through the last 80 minutes of this podcast, but in excess. Remember, like I said in the beginning of this podcast, thyroid is in a Goldilocks zone. We don't want too low, but we also don't want too high. And a lot of people are pushing that titration up to levels that are not only catabolic, but also tachycardic. Like there's so many downstream effects that people aren't thinking about. And coaches
Insomnia.
don't even understand the physiology of this, yet they're prescribing this to clients. And then I have people coming to me and it's like, yeah, no wonder you felt like it was horrendous how you felt, but also you were in a state where you're in a precarious position. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. An analogy popped in my head. I'm still formulating, but I'm going to throw it out there because it sounds like it's one that might fit with folks. So imagine your diet is a trip you're taking in a car, right? And you want to go as fast as you can, but this car is kind of precarious in that it's some of the paint job and some of the panels can be very easily lost if you try to go so fast. So that's kind of like your muscle mass. If you try to diet too hard, too fast, muscle loss will be a concern if you try to do that for too long, especially. So what some of these coaches will do is say, well, the faster we go, the more fat loss we have. But if the faster you go with your car, the more you start to lose paint and you have panels flying off and your rear view, your mirror just kind of pop off and your bumper comes loose. you will lose muscle at the same time. If you go slow, those things are going to stay. I bought an RV one time that someone had kind of patched together, and I got out in the heat and the air conditioner went off, and literally the thing was falling apart. I was just driving it back from California to Arizona. Like panels were coming off, the roof was falling apart. So that's what's happening potentially if you up your thyroid to, if it's you become hyperthyroid, you're turning on protein catabolism. And there's a study, of course there's a study, right?
I got one. I know you got one, my friend.
Gelfland, 1987, and they used, and this isn't a whole lot, but they used just 150 micrograms of T3 a day for 1 week. And sure enough, there was an increase in basal metabolic rate of 21%. But they also had an increase in nitrogen loss and leucine oxidation of about 45%. Right? So nitrogen loss being kind of the big one here. So that's reflective of how much protein is being broken down. So that could be countered in various ways. But one of the interesting things here too is that they tested what would happen with or without beta blockade. So they blocked the beta receptors. So they wanted to see to what extent this elevation in metabolic rate and elevation in nitrogen loss was mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. So they tried to eliminate sympathetic nervous activity, at least on the beta receptors. Go back to last podcast to see how important that is. And it didn't make a difference. So the thyroid hormone, to some degree, although it's interacting with all these other systems we talked about, when you're in a hyperthyroid state, it's running the show. You're going to have some nitrogen losses. You're going to have some unwanted protein muscle losses. That's all there 100%. Is to it.
I think the most concerning part of that study was that they even labeled it as a thyrotoxic condition. Like they knew this was a 1 week. Essentially, what they wanted to see was body protein wasting caused by thyroid hormone excess that's in the. So we have coaches that are prescribing these protocols that are through the roof, and I don't think they really understand the potential downstream effects that they could have. And so there's actually another study that it's a longer term intervention. It's a 6-week T3 treatment where they went significantly higher. So I think they started at 50 micrograms. I think that might have been like the baseline dose essentially. So if we look clinically, most people are getting a replacement dose at 25 micrograms of T3 because the body endogenously produces between 23 and 29 micrograms. So on a replacement perspective, that's generally where people will go. And a lot of times they'll start, if we look therapeutically, we start with T4 monotherapy. So T4 by itself, we provide the substrate, and then a lot of times they'll add in T3, but they'll actually add it in at a lower dose. So I'll tell you personally, when I was prescribed T4 and then eventually T3 therapy in conjunction with it, they started me off at 50 micrograms of T4, which just didn't do enough for my system. Went up to 100 micrograms. Eventually, I had a practitioner or endocrinologist that eventually said, listen, I think that you're going to be more of a candidate for dual therapy. I wasn't getting the symptom relief that my blood work looked better, but I still had a lot of symptomology of the hair loss, the low energy levels, the fatigue, the brain fog, the constipation, things that no one wants to talk about, but this is the brutal honest truth. And so when I got to T3 therapy, subjectively, I felt better. I also had better energy levels. I started feeling a lot more of what I should have felt from being in a euthyroid condition. And so, but they started me off at 12.5 micrograms, and that's been a great dose for me. So you don't have to blast this by any means. But anyway, there's a study that looks at 6-week interventions. So not 1 week like Gelfand. And so in 6-week intervention, now, this is what's very interesting about this. We're looking at body composition because Gelfand does not look at that. They look at the actual nitrogen excretion, essentially protein degradation levels. Now, this study found that T3 treatment at 50 micrograms produced significant losses in both lean body mass and fat mass. But here's the thing. In 6 weeks, what they found was that lean mass, they lost 2.7 pounds of fat mass, but they lost 1.5 kilograms of lean mass. So if we look at the proportions of that, over 1/3 of the lean mass losses in the study were from the excess thyroid hormone, essentially. They were coming from lean body mass. Now, a lot of people will look at, and I've done this myself, GLP-1s and the exorbitant weight loss that they cause and say, well, listen, there's 2 studies, step 1 trial and I think like the step 8 trial that looked at actual body composition results. And they see between the 2 of them, there was one study that found a 40% decrease in lean body mass, and another one that found 41%. And a lot of people are hating, even medical practitioners hating on GLP-1s. I've been one person that I did make that statement early on. And then I really started teasing out into literature and actually looking at the calorie intake that they were utilizing, and then realized, hey, listen, generally we see in weight loss without protein, and without weight training, about 25% loss. Actually, in women, we see actually less. It's about 15% loss. There's a recent meta-analysis and systematic review that looked at that. So if someone's not weight training and they're not eating high protein, for women, we see about 15% of the weight that is lost is from lean body mass. In men, it's up to 25% of the weight that's lost is from lean body mass. But even in this thyroid condition, we're seeing, say, around 35 to 40%, give or take, is from lean body mass. And the same thing with GLP-1. So we got to put it in the same categories. A lot of people,
Right.
a bodybuilding coach will hate on GLP-1 agonists, but then they'll blast thyroid with their clients. And it's kind of like, guys, this is all obviously polypharmacy, but we have to look at this objectively and really understand the mechanism and the potential harms of utilizing these things in excessive doses. There's a difference between a therapeutic treatment where you're replacing someone that has a clinical deficiency or a clinical issue, a pathology, essentially, someone that has hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, has had, the thyroid gland removed. And there's a difference between really blasting something to a point that it's excess pharmacology.
Thyrotoxic, like the term that we brought up before. So I have thoughts, but I don't know we have time. I think we need to shut it down. That was a nice closing statement, I think.
Scott, give me your closing statement, my man. Go with it.
Okay. Okay. You're going to lose. Thyroid hormone will tend to drop depending on your carbohydrate intake. It's something that just happens. We have these case studies, which we haven't brought up with natural bodybuilding competitors. It just goes down. It's just part of the process. But this hasn't borne out so far in the intermittent dieting studies is that we have some magical effect on thyroid. But there are some data at least suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's can be effect on appetite, some psychological effects. One of the studies suggested appetite, I think.
So what's very interesting about thyroid is actually we see when someone's hypothyroid, sometimes with low thyroid levels, they can actually see a decrease in appetite. Whereas when someone becomes hyperthyroid, they actually can increase hunger. So that's why I talk about this Goldilocks zone. You want to be euthyroid, meaning you're in balance from a T3 and T4 perspective.
I was referring to the intermittent dieting studies, what the benefits would be.
Oh, so yes, when it comes down to intermittent dieting, what we see from the most recent studies, the PO study found that there was lower, essentially subjective hunger. And then Bill Campbell's study, which actually was just penned by Seidler, found a decrease in disinhibition. So essentially they didn't feel the propensity to go off their diet and kind of break. It was almost the abstinence violation effect where essentially one cookie becomes an entire platter where they just say, fuck it.
Yeah. So that's something that won't necessarily show up in your blood work, but I don't think the studies aren't looking at actually what bodybuilders are doing and the way they're doing it. And one thing that I think is important, work with your coach or do it on your own, is that a lot of these studies are standardized protocols, and we know that there's going to be so much variability, especially when you start getting the single-digit body fat percentage.
Absolutely.
Some people can just go through and they can go hardcore all the way through, and they don't need the carb up because that would make you worthless and weak. And other people are smarter about it, and maybe they're getting tremendous metabolic effects that we don't see on average in these studies. So finding what works for you is almost ends up being the bottom line of these sorts of things. But there's some things to be discovered still in the scientific research, which maybe we'll see sometime if someone comes up with a unique scientific study where they've got some way of quote unquote objectively auto-regulating in the way a coach would, maybe just with subjective measures. That would be interesting to see. The problem is that being objective when you're subjectively quote unquote starving during a diet is tough.
Very difficult. And that's why coaches come in handy for a lot of individuals. And that's why I found I work with many experienced, both coaches, clinicians, nutritionists, other competitors, and they can't get out of their own way. And it's very hard for them to be objective. Sometimes they're the type A individual that they just want to push all the time. They don't know when to pull back, or sometimes they've gotten a little soft on themselves and they need someone to just kind of say, hey, listen, if you really want to get to that next level, you need to do this, this, and that. And we need to push you into a direction where you get out of your comfort zone, because what you're doing has only worked up into this point. And in order to get something different, you're going to have to be willing to do something different. But as always, Scott, let the audience know where they can find you. And also, I want to thank you for being back on the show, my friend.
Oh yeah, this was fun. I wish we could go. I wish we had more time, but yeah.
As do I, my man.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. You can find my podcast, Muscle Minds, on YouTube. I think we're on Spotify, all those regular places. You can just Google Scott Stevenson bodybuilding. You will find my website that way. So I should be out there.
Hell yeah. Well, Scott, thank you again. As always, guys, thank you for listening to another episode of the Chasing Clarity podcast. If you need anything from me, whether you have inquiries, questions, or you have interest in one-on-one coaching, please feel free to reach out to me at my email, which is BrandonDeCruz or bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. And you can find me on Instagram at BrandonDeCruz_. Have a great weekend, guys. Peace.
Adios.
Hold up, Scott.